You're standing in a cave. It's 170,000 years ago. There's no thermostat. There's no fleece jacket. There's no Amazon package showing up with a hoodie inside it. There's just you, your bare skin, and an ice age that is actively trying to kill you. And somewhere, at some point, one of your ancestors looked at an animal hide lying on the ground and thought, wait, what if I put that on my body? This is the story of how humans discovered clothing, not fashion, not trends, not the guy at the office who somehow wears shorts in December. We're talking about the very first time a human being wrapped something around their body on purpose, and why that decision might be one of the reasons our species is still here at all. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Clothing doesn't start with weaving. It doesn't start with cotton fields or silk routes or sewing machines. It starts with survival. And the evidence for exactly when it started is stranger and comes from a stranger source than almost anyone expects. Let's start with the obvious question. Humans are naked apes, literally. Compared to almost every other mammal our size, we have shockingly little body hair. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, are covered in it. We are not. Evolutionary biologists believe humans lost most of our body hair somewhere between 1 and 3 million years ago, likely as an adaptation to help us cool down while hunting in the hot African savanna. Less hair meant more sweat evaporation, which meant we could run prey animals into exhaustion under the sun. It was a brilliant adaptation for one specific environment: hot, dry, equatorial Africa. The problem is humans didn't stay there, and once you start migrating out of Africa into colder climates, that same hairless body that made you an efficient hunter under the sun turns into a serious liability the moment the sun goes down, or the moment you cross into a region with actual winters. So, somewhere along the way, humans needed a workaround, and the workaround was other animals' fur. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely clever, because figuring out when humans started wearing clothes is not as simple as finding old clothes. Fabric and hide rot, they disintegrate. A leather cloak from 100,000 years ago is not sitting in a museum anywhere because it simply could not survive that long buried in soil. So, how do scientists know when clothing started? The answer involves lice. Yes, lice. Stay with me, because this is one of the most brilliant pieces of detective work in all of anthropology. Humans host two separate species of lice: head lice, which live in the hair on your scalp, and body lice, which live in clothing and only move on to skin briefly to feed. Body lice cannot survive without fabric. They need the fibers of clothing to lay their eggs in. No clothing, no body lice. It's that simple. So evolutionary biologists reasoned that body lice could only have evolved as a distinct species after humans started wearing clothes regularly enough to give a parasite something to live in. In 2003, a team of researchers led by Mark Stoneking analyzed the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, essentially measuring how long ago these two lice populations split into separate species. Their answer stunned people. Somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That means clothing, real, regular, worn daily clothing, may be well over 100,000 years old. Older than agriculture by a massive margin. Older than pottery. Older than almost every technology we associate with early civilization. Humans were wrapping animal skins around their bodies tens of thousands of years before anyone planted a seed on purpose. Let that sink in for a second. We figured out when humans started wearing clothes by studying the sex lives of parasites that live in fabric. Science is sometimes beautiful in the most absurd ways. But lice genetics gives us a rough window, not a smoking gun. So let's talk about the physical evidence, because it exists and it's older than most people assume. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, archaeologists have found bone and ivory needles with tiny eyed holes, precisely the kind of tool you would need to sew hides together into fitted garments, rather than just draping them loosely. The oldest confirmed sewing needle, found at Denisova Cave in Siberia, dates back roughly 50,000 years and was carved from bird bone, polished smooth, with a hole delicately bored through one end. That is not a crude tool. That is a refined piece of technology built by someone who had clearly made needles before and knew exactly what they were doing. Even more remarkable, in 2016, researchers analyzing stone tools from sites in Morocco identified specialized bone tools dating back approximately 120,000 years that showed wear patterns consistent with scraping and softening animal hides, essentially prehistoric leatherworking kits. Alongside these tools, archaeologists found the bones of carnivores like foxes and jackals, with cut marks specifically in locations consistent with pelt removal, not meat extraction. In other words, these animals weren't necessarily being hunted primarily for food. They were hunted or at least processed specifically for their fur. That detail matters enormously because it suggests humans weren't just occasionally draping a hide over their shoulders when it got cold. They had a system: hunt the animal, remove the pelt carefully, scrape it clean, soften it, and shape it into something wearable. So we have two independent lines of evidence, one genetic, one archaeological, both pointing to the same rough era. Somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 years ago, humans went from occasionally being naked and cold to being a species that regularly wore processed animal hides. And that timing is not a coincidence. It lines up almost perfectly with when modern humans began migrating out of Africa into colder regions of Europe and Asia. Clothing wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a technology that made that migration survivable in the first place. Think about what that actually means. Without clothing, Homo sapiens likely never leaves Africa in any meaningful numbers. Without clothing, there's no surviving an Ice Age winter in what is now France or Siberia. The entire human story, every civilization built in a temperate or cold climate, every culture that developed outside the tropics, arguably depends on a group of prehistoric humans figuring out how to turn a dead animal's skin into a wearable barrier between their bodies and the cold. Clothing isn't a footnote in human history, it's one of the load-bearing inventions that made the rest of human history possible. Now, here's where we have to be careful about a common misconception, because clothing and tailored clothing are two very different things, separated by a lot of time. The earliest clothing almost certainly wasn't sewn or shaped at all. It was simply draped, a hide thrown over the shoulders and tied with a strip of sinew or plant fiber. Functional, crude, effective. Tailored clothing, garments actually cut and stitched to fit the contours of a human body, arms, legs, a torso, likely emerged much later, closely tied to the invention of that eyed needle around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. And this upgrade wasn't cosmetic. Fitted clothing traps body heat far more effectively than a loose draped hide, which is precisely why the appearance of sewn garments in the archaeological record lines up with humans successfully surviving in genuinely brutal environments, like the Siberian Arctic and Ice Age Europe, regions that would have been essentially unlivable in loose furs alone. There's also a fascinating layer to this story involving Neanderthals, because they were dealing with cold European winters for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived there. And yet, the archaeological evidence for tailored Neanderthal clothing is notably thinner than for modern humans. Neanderthal sites show plenty of hide-scraping tools, but very few eyed needles, and their toolkit suggests simpler wrap and drape-style coverings rather than fitted garments. Some anthropologists have proposed that this difference, modern humans developing sewn, layered, weatherproof clothing, while Neanderthals largely didn't, may have been one of several factors that gave Homo sapiens an edge in colonizing the harshest environments of Ice Age Eurasia. It's a genuinely wild thought. Something as simple as a needle and thread might have outcompeted an entire other species of human. Let's talk about the cultural side of this, because clothing was never purely about temperature. Almost immediately, alongside the practical function, clothing picked up meaning. Archaeologists have found perforated shell beads at sites in Africa and the Middle East dating back over 100,000 years. Shells with holes clearly bored for stringing onto cord, found far from any coastline, meaning they were carried, traded, and valued as ornamentation. This tells us something important. From an extraordinarily early point, humans weren't just using coverings to survive. They were using what they wore to communicate: status, identity, group membership, even spiritual belief. A necklace of shells traded hundreds of miles inland isn't a survival tool, it's a statement. It's one of the earliest pieces of evidence we have that humans were thinking symbolically, using objects on their bodies to say something about who they were before written language ever existed. This dual nature of clothing, practical survival gear on one hand, symbolic identity marker on the other, runs through literally every human culture that followed. Ancient Egyptians wore linen not just for the brutal desert heat, but because the color and quality of that linen signaled social rank. Mesoamerican cultures used elaborate feathered garments specifically reserved for royalty and priests, garments so labor-intensive to produce that simply owning one was a declaration of power. Indigenous peoples across the Americas used specific patterns, furs, and adornments to indicate tribal identity, marital status, even spiritual roles. A shaman's ceremonial dress was never just an outfit. It was understood as a transformation, a way of stepping into a different kind of presence entirely. Clothing, almost from its invention, was doing two jobs at once: keeping you alive and telling everyone around you exactly who you were. There's a medical and practical dimension worth mentioning too, one that rarely comes up. Clothing didn't just protect against the cold, it protected against the sun, against insect bites, against thorns and rough terrain during long-distance travel. And it allowed humans to carry things: food, tools, infants, freeing up hands that would otherwise be occupied. Some anthropologists argue that simple slings and wraps for carrying babies may be nearly as old as clothing itself, and this single innovation, being able to carry an infant hands-free while foraging or traveling, would have had an enormous survival value for early human groups. Clothing wasn't just a shield against weather, it was infrastructure for daily life. And then there's the uncomfortable part of the story. The part where an ancient, practical, deeply meaningful human technology eventually gets swallowed by mass industry. For roughly 100,000 years, clothing was made by hand, by the person who was going to wear it, or by someone in their immediate community, using materials sourced locally, built to last, repaired rather than replaced. Then came the invention of the spinning wheel, then the mechanical loom, then in the late 1700s, the industrial textile mill. Within a single century, garment production went from a slow, deliberate, deeply personal craft to a mechanized global industry. By the early 2000s, the rise of what's now called fast fashion had turned garments meant to be worn for years into products designed to be discarded within months. What began as a life-saving technology, a needle and a scraped hide protecting a human being from freezing to death on an Ice Age plane, has in the modern era become one of the most environmentally destructive industries on the planet, responsible for enormous water consumption, chemical pollution, and mountains of textile waste. The needle that helped Homo sapiens survive an ice age is, in a strange and uncomfortable way, connected by an unbroken thread to a landfill full of unworn t-shirts. So, when did humans first wear clothes? The honest answer is we don't know the exact day, and we never will, because the very first garment disintegrated long before anyone could study it. But the evidence, lice genetics whispering a number between 83,000 and 170,000 years, hide-scraping tools in Morocco dating past 120,000 years, a delicately carved needle in a Siberian cave, all of it points toward the same conclusion. Clothing is not a modern convenience. It is one of the oldest technologies our species ever developed, older than farming, older than writing, arguably older than complex language itself. It emerged not from vanity, but from necessity, from a hairless ape trying to survive in a world that had gotten colder than its body was built for. What is absolutely clear is that by the time the historical record begins anywhere in the world, humans were already wrapped, layered, adorned, and dressed according to codes of status and belief that had been developing for tens of thousands of years. The specific materials changed, the techniques changed, the meanings changed, but the behavior, the simple act of covering the body on purpose, was already ancient by the time anyone thought to write it down. There's something quietly moving about that. Every time you pull on a jacket against the cold tonight, you're repeating an act that some hairless, shivering ancestor of yours first figured out over 100,000 years ago beside a fire, wrapping a dead animal's skin around their body and discovering that they could survive the night after all.